Hello everyone and happy Friday. I'm Nitsa and I'm back this week with another MTG Top 10, and my schedule should be back to normal now after missing last week's Top 10, so you have lots more Top 10s to look forward to. This week's Top 10, like the last one did, is inspired by Amonkhet. Last time I looked at Cycling, a mechanic making a return in Amonkhet. This time around, I'm looking at cards that put -1/-1 counters on things, because that seems to be an interesting sub-theme within Amonkhet, represented by cards like Channeler Initiate. This made me wonder what cards that put -1/-1 counters on creatures have seen the most success in Magic's history. Amonkhet is of course not the first time we have seen a -1/-1 counter theme in a set. We also saw it with the Persist and Infect mechanics, both of which make some appearances on this list. For a card to be considered for this list, it had to actually put -1/-1 counters on creatures. Cards that simply have the term -1/-1 counter on them, like Melira's Sylvok Outcast, were not considered. Now, a quick recap of how I score cards on this list. Cards receive points depending on how many Grand Prix or Pro Tour Top 8s they've received, with a Pro Tour Top 8 worth twice as much as a Grand Prix Top 8. The cards in this list are then arranged numbers 10 through 1, with the highest score being found at number 1. Legacy and Vintage Championships are scored as Pro Tour Top 8s as they represent the highest level of play in those particular formats despite not actually being Pro Tours. In addition to the 10 cards on this list, you can find every card involving -1/-1 counters that didn't make this list but managed at least 1 point in the description below. Before we get started, try your hand at guessing what the number 1 card on the list is in the comments. Now, let's get started. At number 10, we have Glistener Elf, the first of several creatures on this list to sport the Infect mechanic, which made creatures do damage as -1/-1 counters and as poison counters to players. Infect decks basically ran as many low-curve creatures with Infect as possible, and a bunch of ways of pumping the creatures to make it possible to win the game in one swing with a creature that starts as small as Glistener Elf does. This elf wasn't the most impressive of Infect creatures, and actually didn't see a whole lot of play in either block or standard, where Infect decks were mostly mono-black. Instead, Glistener Elf has seen the most impressive play in Modern, making its debut there in 2012 at Pro Tour Return to Ravnica, where it managed to pick up a top 8. Ever since then, it has consistently picked up top 8s in the Modern format. Glistener Elf has also recently made some noise in Legacy, where it was realized that Infect paired pretty well with Berserk, and it picked up 4 Grand Prix top 8s in that format as well. While it hasn't done anything since 2016, it does seem likely that the Elf will continue to put up some numbers at least in Infect decks across Modern and Legacy. At number 9, we have another creature with Infect, Viridian Corruptor. However, it has a very different resume from Glistener Elf, starting with the fact that it did most of its work in Standard, somewhere Glistener Elf didn't do anything. Because this could blow up artifacts, it actually saw a ton of play in Standard, where the fact that it had Infect wasn't actually capitalized on all that much, and it was mostly just used as an efficient way to deal with problem artifacts while also giving you a blocker. It has seen some play in the sideboard of Modern and Legacy Infect decks too, since it is so good against Affinity and other artifact-heavy decks, while also providing a body that can be pumped with all the powerful pump spells that are in those decks, and it will likely continue to put up numbers in those formats. After a couple creatures with Infect, we move to another -1/-1 counter-centric mechanic of Magic's past, Persist. This mechanic made it so that if your creature were to be put into a graveyard and it didn't have a -1/-1 counter, it instead came back into play with a -1/-1 counter. These creatures frequently came with useful into the battlefield abilities, making the fact that you got 2 triggers of those abilities very powerful, while also making the creature more resilient. Puppeteer Click is an example of this, as when it comes into play, it allows you to steal a creature card from your opponent's graveyard and give it haste. Doing this once is obviously good, doing this twice is great, especially when it comes with a reasonable 3/2 and then 2/1 flying body. It saw a lot of play in block, where the fact that it was a fairy became relevant too, as fairy tribal decks were arguably the best deck in that format. The deck was so powerful that it carried over into Standard, where the Click continued to see play. While fairies have made a little bit of noise in extended and in non-rotating formats, the Click was too slow to come along for the ride in those faster and more powerful formats, and it hasn't seen competitive play since 2009. We move from a creature with Persist back to a creature with Infect, Blighted Agent. Creatures with Infect are already really scary, since your opponent could always pump them and make the damage they do to you lethal in a single turn, but at least you can block those creatures with Infect, right? Well, not so much with Blighted Agent. It provided a sure source of damage to your opponent, making it one of the better creatures to run in an Infect deck. However, like Glistener Elf, he went unplayed in block or Standard, where mono-black Infect was the more common deck. However, the agent has been a mainstay in Modern and Legacy Infect decks, just like its elf cousin. While Infect has sort of taken a backseat to Death Shadow Zoo decks, which operate in a similar manner, Infect could always make a comeback, and Blighted Agent would almost definitely be around for the ride. At number 6, we have Black Sun Zenith, the first non-creature on this list. Black Sun Zenith is a powerful board sweeper that puts -1/-1 counters on everything. Even if you can't quite kill everything on the board with the Zenith, you can at least make those creatures who survive it small enough to be more easily managed. Black Sun Zenith saw play primarily in control decks, as board sweepers often do, first managing to top 8 at a Mirrodin Besieged Block Pro Tour in 2011. In Standard, it did most of its work, though, showing up in Blue-Black Control, Grixis Control, and Tezzeret control decks as a way to make sure that aggro decks couldn't kill you in the early part of the game. It hasn't seen play since it rotated out of Standard, but it is a staple in EDH. At number 5, we return to the powerful Persist mechanic with Glenalendra Archmage, who, like Puppeteer Click, also happened to be a fairy. Yeah, Wizards pushed them pretty hard in Lorwyn. While it didn't have a powerful into the battlefield ability to go with Persist, the Archmage comes with something even more obnoxious, the ability to counter non-creature spells for only 1 blue mana. The Persist mechanic means that the Archmage can then just come back as a 1/1 who can counter another non-creature spell, sometimes on the same turn, making this card frequently a 2-for-1. In the meantime, it could beat down on your opponent in the air too. The Archmage first saw play in Standard, appearing in Fairy decks, as well as in control decks that were not tribal-oriented, putting up perhaps its most impressive single finish at Worlds in 2008, where it picked up 3 top 8s. The Archmage is powerful enough for non-rotating formats too, though. In Modern, it appeared in Birthing Pod decks primarily, where it was a useful creature to toolbox up in the event your opponent was trying to cast a powerful non-creature spell, such as one to blow up your Birthing Pod. After Birthing Pod got banned, it stopped seeing much play, though, and while it may find a new home, it hasn't done much in over 2 years. At number 4, we have another persistent creature, Murderous Redcap, who saw play in the Standard of his day, as he was obviously a good card because of all of the value he brings. He does 2 damage to a creature when he first enters play, can trade with something else, and then come back into play to do 1 damage to another thing. He appeared in a ton of Standard decks that just happened to be capable of playing him, like Doran the Siege Tower decks, Fairy decks, Black-Green Elf decks, and Black-White Token decks. However, he really took off in Modern in decks that ran Birthing Pod and Malira Sylvok Outcast. This deck, called Malira Pod, sought to assemble a combo through the power of Birthing Pod that would allow Murderous Redcap to do infinite damage. All it took was getting the Redcap in play, who now could not have a -1/-1 counter put on him, and thus could infinitely come back into play, along with Malira and a free sacrifice outlet. This deck ran rampant in Modern for a while, before the pod was eventually banned out of Modern in 2015. However, the Redcap has managed to live on in decks that still try to assemble the combo, but with Court of Calling instead of Birthing Pod. At number 3, we have by far the oldest card on this list, Serrated Arrows. By today's standards, this card is not very good. For 4 mana, you get an artifact with 3 arrowhead counters. You can then tap the arrows and remove a counter from it to put a -1/-1 counter on something else. Creatures at the time were much more fragile than they were today, and that's something to keep in mind, because that increased how good this card was in its time. This is incredibly inefficient for us today, though, but in its day, it gave decks and colors that wouldn't have had access to good removal a source of removal. Because the arrows were colorless, they were played everywhere, kind of like Hangerback Walker or Walking Ballista of today. Think that's hyperbolic and don't believe me that this card was powerful and ubiquitous like those two? Take a look at some of the results Serrated Arrows put up. At the very first Pro Tour ever, held in New York in 1996, it put up 6 top 8s. Followed that up with 3 top 8s at Worlds that year, and would pick up 6 top 8s at Pro Tour Chicago in 1997, and so on. It was a dominant card in its own day. It got reprinted as a time-shifted card in Time Spiral block, where it also managed to see some play. It actually managed to continue to get played up until 2008, where it made its last appearance at Pro Tour Hollywood in a Merfolk deck. Blue has a hard time finding removal, and the arrows provided a source. At number 2, we have the card that I thought would be the number 1 on this list, Inkmoth Nexus. The Nexus is a land, and a colorless one at that, meaning it can be played in a lot of different decks. It is a creature land that becomes a 1/1 flyer with Infect, an artifact creature too, and that is no small thing, as its evasiveness has claimed many a player's life. The Nexus was so good that at the only Mirrodin Besieged block Pro Tour Nagoya in 2011, it appeared in all 8 of the top 8 deck lists. And these were things as varied as Infect, Tempered Steel, Control decks, and Red deck wins. There really was no reason not to play the thing in block because it was just so good. In Standard, it was also a staple, putting up tons of top 8s in multiple different decks. Artifact-centric aggro decks and control decks, Tempered Steel and Tezzeret Control respectively, and also in standard versions of Infect. It also saw play in the incredibly dominant Cobblade deck, where it put up events like Grand Prix Singapore in 2011 with 7 top 8s for the Nexus there. Most of Caw-Blade got banned, but not the Nexus, which continued to see play in all manner of successful standard decks, including Kessig Titan, and again Infect and Tempered Steel. The Nexus has continued to see play in Modern to this day, both in Infect and in Affinity decks. Affinity decks can do an Infect deck impression with the card, since equipping it with Cranial Plating or putting counters on it from Arcbound Ravager is often enough to win the game in a single swing. It still sees a ton of play in Modern and won't be stopping anytime soon. It also saw play in the short-lived Infect decks in the Legacy format mentioned earlier on in this video, but Modern is probably where its future lies. But can it ever get past the number 1 card on this list? Which is Kitchen Finks. Another card with Persist, Kitchen Finks has proven to be the best of the bunch by a wide margin. While it works well in the Melira combo like Murderous Redcap, gaining you infinite life instead of doing infinite damage, it also happens to be an incredibly efficient creature, and a great card against aggro decks in multiple formats, since it has the potential to trade with 2 cards while gaining you 4 life. Might not sound like much, but it really takes the wind out of an aggro deck when you can do that. While there was no block Pro Tour for Kitchen Finks, there were 2 Grand Prix where it picked up 6 of the possible 16 top 8s in a wide variety of decks, which it continued to do in Standard, showing up in decks like Doron, Revelark, Elf decks, Control decks. Kitchen Finks was a card that was good in just about any deck that could cast it in Standard. As I have alluded to though, Modern would be its biggest home, where it appeared in Birthing Pod decks, the most impressively, but also in Zoo decks, Jund decks, Blue-White Control decks, and you get the picture. It has appeared in decks that can cast it, and it should. And it is one of the most efficient creatures in all of Magic, thanks to how easily it 2-for-1s and slows down your opponent. Well, that does it for this week's Top 10. Amonkhet will fully be spoiled later on today, and I need to get to work on my full set limited review. But I will be back with another Top 10 list next week, another Amonkhet-inspired one. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click the like button. If you have suggestions for a future Top 10, let me know in the comments below. If you want to make sure you catch all of my Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. You can also find more of my content over on the Ether Hub. Also, my content is supported in part by 5colorcombo.com, a great website for Magic the Gathering content. One of the things that 5Color Combo is best known for is their sweet original playmats and tokens. Right now, they are running a Kickstarter campaign that helps fund new tokens, and you can actually receive tokens for your donation, including these really cool 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse zombie tokens that you see here. You can find more information about the Kickstarter in the description below. Time is running out for you to claim your tokens, so act fast.